I still remember the exact sound the kitchen made when everything was normal. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock above the stove, the way the morning light came through the curtain over the sink and made a long yellow stripe across the linoleum floor. I used to stand at that counter every morning with my coffee and watch that stripe of light move, inch by inch, while the house woke up around me. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, and for a long time, ordinary was everything I wanted. My name is Deborah. I'm 61 years old. I live in a town called Clarksville, Mississippi, which is the kind of place where everybody knows what truck you drive and everybody has an opinion about what you should do with your life. I was born here, married here, raised my children here. I buried my mother here. I thought I would bury myself here too, and that would be the whole of the story, neat and complete, the way lives are supposed to go when you do everything right. I did not do everything right. I need to say that plainly before anything else, because this is not a story about a good mother who had a hard time. This is a story about a mother who failed her child in the most fundamental way a mother can fail, and who has had to live inside that failure every single day for 11 years, turning it over like a stone, looking at what's underneath. I am not telling you this story because I want your sympathy. I am telling it because I think there are other women out there standing at their kitchen counters right now, holding their coffee, hearing their child's words echo in the air, and they are about to make the same choice I made, and I need them to understand what that choice actually costs. My son's name was Marcus Allen Tate. He was born on a Tuesday in late October 1987 during a rainstorm that knocked the power out at the hospital for 45 minutes. I always told him that story. I always said, even the lights went out to welcome you, like the whole world was making room. He would roll his eyes at me the way teenagers do, but I could see the corner of his mouth pulling up. He liked that story. He liked that I had a story for him. Marcus was the kind of child who made everything around him feel a little more alive. He was curious about everything: bugs, birds, the names of clouds, why certain flowers only opened at night. He brought me caterpillars in jelly jars. He cried once, properly cried, when we found a dead cardinal in the yard, and he made me help him bury it under the magnolia tree with a small flat stone on top. He was 7 years old. I remember thinking, this one feels things deeply. This one is going to need the world to be gentler than it is. I was right about that. I just didn't understand that the harshness he would need protecting from would come from me. He was 17 when he told me. It was a Sunday evening in March, which in Mississippi means the azaleas are starting and the air smells like something just woke up. We had come home from church, the two of us, because his father, my husband, Ray, had stayed behind for a deacon meeting. Marcus was still in his church clothes, that blue button-down I'd ironed that morning. We were in the kitchen. I was taking the lid off a pot of soup I'd left in the slow cooker. He was standing near the doorway, not sitting, which I remember noticing. He was standing like someone who needed to be close to an exit. He said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." I said, "Go ahead, baby," and I didn't even look up from the pot. He said, "I'm gay." The kitchen went very quiet. Not the normal quiet of a room, something different, something that felt like the air had been replaced with something heavier. I set the lid down. I turned to look at him. He was watching me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something that was equal parts hope and terror, and I understood in that moment that he had been carrying this toward me for a long time, that this had taken enormous courage. I understood all of that. And I still said the wrong thing. I said, "No, you're not." Just that, "No, you're not," as if it were a misunderstanding, as if he told me the sky was green and I was gently correcting him. I don't know where it came from, except that it came from a deep place of panic about Ray, about our church, about the neighbors, about the life I had built and what this would do to it. None of which was Marcus's problem. None of which was his responsibility to manage. But I made it his problem immediately, automatically, without even choosing to. He said, "Mom." I said, "We don't need to talk about this right now." He said, "I've been trying to tell you for 2 years." I didn't know what to do with that. 2 years. He had been carrying it for 2 years, working up to that kitchen doorway, and my response was to put the lid back on the pot and say we didn't need to talk about it right now. I have gone back to that moment more times than I can count. I have stood in it and looked at every angle of it. I have asked myself what I was thinking, and the honest answer is that I wasn't thinking about Marcus at all. I was thinking about myself. What followed that Sunday was 3 weeks of a silence so thick it was almost physical. Marcus went to school, came home, did his homework, ate dinner, and disappeared into his room. Ray didn't know. I hadn't told him. I had decided in that cowardly way I had, that if I simply didn't speak about it, perhaps it would resolve itself. Perhaps Marcus would come to me and say he'd made a mistake. I prayed for that. I am ashamed to write it, but I prayed every morning that my son would come to me and say he had been confused, that everything was fine, that our life could continue the way I'd arranged it in my mind. He didn't come to me. What happened instead was that Ray found something on Marcus's phone. I don't know exactly what, he never told me the details, and I never asked, because by that point the details didn't matter. What mattered was that Ray knew, and Ray's response was not silence. Ray's response was noise, enormous and immediate and terrible. There was screaming. There were words I will not repeat. I stood in the hallway between them like a wall that was too thin to stop anything, and I did not defend my son. I told him that what his father was saying came from love. I told him that we needed to give everyone time to calm down. I put my hands on Ray's arm instead of on Marcus's. Marcus looked at me once during all of that, just once. It was not an angry look. It was something worse than anger. It was the look of someone who has realized, fully and finally, that the place they thought was safe is not safe at all. It was the look of someone revising everything they thought they knew. I felt it go into me like a cold key turning in a lock. He left 2 days later. He was 17 years old. He packed a bag while Ray was at work and I was at the grocery store, and he left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I love you both, I can't stay." That was all. I love you both. After everything, he still wrote that, "I love you both." I stood in his room for a long time that afternoon. I looked at the books on his shelf. The jelly jar he still kept on his desk, empty now, that he'd used for caterpillars when he was small. The flat stone from the cardinal's grave that he'd kept on his windowsill for 10 years. I sat on the edge of his bed and I thought, he took so little. He left so much. And I didn't understand then what that meant, that he was leaving the things he couldn't carry, not the things he didn't want. The church helped. I don't mean that kindly. I mean the church stepped in and gave us a framework for what had happened that made it easier for me to avoid the truth. The pastor spoke about prodigal sons. The women in my Sunday school group spoke about prayer and patience and the Lord's plan. Ray's family rallied around him. Nobody rallied around Marcus. Nobody said his name the way you say the name of someone who matters, and I let that happen. I sat in those pews, and I let my child's name become a cautionary tale, and I told myself it was because I was being strong. I wasn't being strong. I was being a coward with a religious vocabulary. Marcus was gone for 3 years before I tried to contact him. He was 20 by then, living in Memphis with a roommate, working at a restaurant. I had gotten his number through a cousin of his who kept in loose touch with both of us. I called him on a Wednesday afternoon in October, his birthday month, and when he answered he sounded older than I expected. His voice had settled into itself. He sounded like a man. I said, "Marcus, it's your mother." He said, "I know." There was a long silence. I had planned what I was going to say. I had rehearsed it in the car on the way to the parking lot of a CVS where I'd sat for 20 minutes before dialing because I didn't want Ray to hear the call. I had prepared words, but when he answered and sounded like a man, all my prepared words fell away and I just said, "I miss you." He said, "I miss you too." That should have been enough. That should have been the beginning of something. But I made a mistake in that call, and the mistake was this. I told him I was still praying for him. I said it with love, genuinely, the way I would have said it about a sick friend or someone going through hard times. I said, "I pray for you every day, baby." And in my mind, that sentence meant I love you and I think about you and you matter to me. But in Marcus's ears, and I understand now why, it meant I am still hoping you will change. It meant I have not accepted you. It meant the door is open, but not all the way. He said, "I know you do, Mom," and something in his voice closed. We talked for 12 more minutes. He told me about his job, his neighborhood, a dog his roommate had gotten. I told him about the house, the yard, a tomato plant I'd started. We were both performing normalcy at each other across a distance that neither of us knew how to close. At the end of the call I said, "Can I call you again?" And he said, "Sure," and I knew from the way he said it that he would not call me first. I called him every few months after that. Sometimes he answered. Sometimes I got voicemail. I always kept it careful and surface level, because going deeper felt dangerous, because I didn't know how to go deeper without going to the place we'd never resolved. I didn't know how to say I'm sorry without first having to look clearly at what I was sorry for, and looking clearly at that thing felt like standing at the edge of something with no bottom. Ray and I existed alongside each other in those years, the way two people can when they have decided, without ever discussing it, to not discuss certain things. The house was quiet. The kitchen made its normal sounds. The light came through the curtain in the morning and made its stripe on the floor. I learned to live in the ordinary life I had chosen over my son, and on most days I convinced myself it was fine. On some days I even believed it. It was his roommate who called me. I want to be precise about this because the timeline still matters to me, the way timelines matter when you are trying to understand exactly where you failed. It was a Thursday morning in January. Marcus was 28. I was at the kitchen counter with my coffee, watching the light come through the curtain, and my phone rang with a number I didn't know. The roommate's name was Daniel. He told me that Marcus had been in the hospital for 2 days with a serious infection. He was diabetic, had been since his mid-20s, something I had learned through the cousin, another detail that had arrived to me second-hand because I had not been present enough to hear it first. Daniel said the infection had become sepsis. Daniel said it was serious. Daniel said I didn't know who else to call. He has your number in his phone under Mom. Under Mom, he still had me under Mom. I drove to Memphis by myself. I did not tell Ray where I was going. I just got in the car and drove, and for 4 hours I talked to Marcus in my head, saying everything I had not said in 11 years. I said I'm sorry for standing in that hallway. I said I'm sorry for every church pew, every prayer that was about my comfort and not your wholeness, every phone call where I kept us shallow because I was afraid of the depth. I said it to the highway. I said it to the flat winter fields. I said it like practicing a speech I was terrified I might not get to give. He was awake when I arrived. He looked thin and tired in the way hospital beds make everyone look thin and tired, but he was awake, and when I came through the door he looked at me and didn't say anything for a long moment. I stood at the foot of the bed. I didn't know whether to come closer or whether that would be unwelcome. 11 years of distance makes you uncertain about the geography of another person's space. He said, "You came." I said, "Of course I came." He said, "You didn't have to." I said, "Yes, I did." I sat down in the chair beside his bed and I took his hand, and I felt something enormous and terrible move through me, something I had been keeping on the other side of a door for over a decade. It felt like grief and relief and horror all at once, grief for what we'd lost, relief that I was here, horror at how close I'd come to never being here at all. I started to cry, not politely, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere below dignity that has nothing to do with composure. Marcus watched me for a moment and then he said quietly, "Mom, it's okay." And I said, "It's not okay. None of this was okay. What I did to you was not okay." He was quiet for a while. The hospital room hummed with its machines. Somewhere down the hall someone was being paged. He was looking at the ceiling, and I was looking at him, and between us, there were 11 years of Sundays and phone calls, and a March evening in the kitchen when everything could have been different. He said, "I used to think about what I would say to you if you ever showed up like this." I said, "What did you decide?" He said, "I decided I'd tell you it wasn't your fault, that you were just a product of where you came from." He paused, "But that's not honest, so I don't think I'm going to say that." I said, "Don't say it, please." He looked at me then. He had Ray's eyes, which had always seemed unfair, but the expression in them was entirely his own. He said, "I needed you to fight for me, not against me. I needed you to fight for me. I needed you to fight for me." I have turned that sentence over 10,000 times since that afternoon. I have worn grooves in it. I understand exactly what it means and exactly where I failed to do it. He did not need me to agree with everything or understand everything or even be comfortable with everything. He needed me to put him first. Before the church, before Ray, before my carefully arranged idea of how my life was supposed to look. He needed to know that when it came down to it, I would choose him. And I had not chosen him. I had chosen my own comfort and called it love. I stayed in Memphis for 4 days. I slept on a cot in his room the first night and in a hotel after that. Daniel, his roommate, was there often, a kind, steady man who had clearly been a better family to Marcus in those years than I had. He was not unkind to me. He brought coffee. He gave us space. I was grateful to him in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Marcus and I talked. Not about everything, not all at once. There is no version of repair that happens in a hospital room over 4 days. But we talked honestly, which was something we hadn't done since he was 17 years old in a kitchen doorway. He told me about his life. He told me about the years right after he left, which were hard in ways that still make my chest ache to think about couches and near misses, the particular loneliness of being a young person without a net. He told me about meeting Daniel, who had been his roommate first and then his closest friend. He told me about the diabetes diagnosis and how frightening it had been to navigate without parents, doing research alone at night, figuring out what questions to ask doctors, adjusting to a condition that could be dangerous if he wasn't careful. He was careful. He had learned to be careful about everything on his own. I told him things too. I told him about the night he left, standing in his room looking at the empty spaces on the shelves. I told him about the cousin who had kept me loosely informed. I told him about the CVS parking lot where I'd sat for 20 minutes before calling him on his birthday. I told him that I had never stopped thinking about him, which was true, and that I understood now that thinking about someone and choosing them are 2 different things, which was also true. He said, "Why didn't you just say you were sorry on one of those calls?" I said, "I think I was afraid that if I started apologizing, I would have to look at exactly what I was apologizing for, and I didn't want to see it clearly." He said, "I know." He said it without anger, which was almost harder than anger would have been. Anger I would have understood. This was something more adult and more devastating, a kind of sad comprehension. He had already done the work of understanding me. He had figured me out from a distance on his own without my help. My child had grown into someone who could see me clearly and had decided still to have me in his phone as mom. The infection responded to treatment. He was discharged on a Saturday morning. I helped him get settled back in the apartment, made a grocery run, sat with him while he rested on the couch. That last afternoon before I drove back to Clarksville, we sat together in his small living room while the winter light came in through the windows, and I thought about all the other light in all the other rooms we had not shared. He was asleep before I left. I stood in the doorway of his room, a different doorway now, his room in his own life, and I looked at him the way I had not let myself look at him in 11 years. He had pictures on his dresser. There was one of him and Daniel at what looked like a state fair, grinning, Marcus's arm around Daniel's shoulder. There was one of a dog I didn't know. And there was one of Marcus as a child, maybe 9 or 10, standing under a magnolia tree in our backyard in Clarksville. I didn't know he had taken that picture with him. I didn't know he carried that yard, that tree, that version of his childhood. I drove home and I told Ray that I had been to see Marcus, and that I intended to keep seeing Marcus, and that if Ray could not support that, we needed to have a conversation about what our marriage was actually built on. Ray was quiet for a long time. He said some things I disagree with, but he did not tell me to stop. I think even Ray, in his stubbornness and his fear, knew that we had already spent enough of Marcus's life on other people's comfort. I want to tell you that the years after that were simple, that we stitched everything back together cleanly, that the story ended in a warm room with everyone reconciled and forgiven. The truth is messier and more human than that. Marcus and I rebuilt slowly. Some phone calls were still careful. Some visits had silences in them that we didn't know how to fill. There were moments I said the wrong thing, not with cruelty, but with the leftover reflexes of old thinking, and we had to navigate those too. He was patient with me in a way he didn't owe me, and I tried to be worthy of that patience, rather than just relieved by it. He came home for Thanksgiving 2 years after the hospital. The first time he had been back in Clarksville in almost a decade. I cooked the things he had liked as a child. I put the leaf in the dining room table. Ray sat at the head of it and said grace, and the grace was short and without subtext, which I counted as something. Marcus sat across from me and ate 2 helpings of sweet potato casserole and told me a long story about a disastrous road trip he and Daniel had taken to Nashville that made me laugh harder than I'd laughed in a long time. It was ordinary. It was the most extraordinary, ordinary evening of my life. He called me the following spring to tell me that Daniel was more than a roommate, that they had been together for 3 years, that he had wanted me to know. I said, I'm glad you told me. I said, I'd like to meet him properly. I meant both of those things without reservation, and I could hear in the small pause before he responded that he was checking my voice for what was underneath, for the old careful edge, the closed door at the bottom of the sentence. It wasn't there. It was the first time it wasn't there. I met Daniel at Easter. He was gentle and funny, and he looked at Marcus the way you want someone to look at the people you love. At one point during the afternoon I looked over and Daniel was washing dishes at my sink, with Marcus drying beside him, and they were talking quietly about something I couldn't hear. And the light was coming through the curtain the way it always does, making that stripe across the floor, and I stood very still and I let myself have that moment. I let it be what it was. I need to tell you about the August that followed, because that is where the second burial lives, and I cannot tell this story honestly without it. He had been managing the diabetes carefully for years. His doctors were confident. He exercised, he watched his diet, he checked his levels the way he checked everything methodically, without complaint. There was nothing that suggested what was coming. There are never signs that suggest what is coming, or if there are, we don't recognize them until afterward when we arrange the story to make sense of the ending. He had a cardiac event, quietly in his sleep on a Wednesday night in August. He was 36 years old. Daniel called me at 5 in the morning. I knew from his voice before he said a word. I am not going to describe the days after that call in detail, because those days belong to a place inside me that is not mine to share in full. What I will say is this. I buried my son in Clarksville, under a sky that was the particular brutal blue that August skis are in Mississippi, and I put a magnolia branch on his casket because of the tree in our backyard that he had loved as a child. And Daniel stood beside me the entire time, holding my arm, and I thought this man loved my son every day of the years I did not, and I am grateful and I am ashamed and I am grateful. What I have been left with is not clean grief. Clean grief would be easier. What I have is grief that has other things folded inside it, regret, guilt, the specific torment of time wasted and words unsaid and years that cannot be unlived. I go to a grief counselor now, a kind woman in Jackson who doesn't tell me to look on the bright side. She lets me sit with the complicated thing and just look at it without trying to make it lighter than it is. I kept the flat stone from his windowsill, the one he'd put over the cardinal in the yard when he was 7. He had carried it through every move, every apartment, every iteration of his life since childhood. Daniel gave it to me after. I keep it on my own windowsill now. Every morning when I stand at the counter with my coffee, I can see it in my peripheral vision. I have thought a great deal in the time since he died about what I would say to the woman I was in that kitchen in March of 2004. The woman who set the lid back down on the pot and said we didn't need to talk about it. I think I would tell her this: you are about to make a choice, and you are going to tell yourself it is not a choice, that it is just how things are, just what faith requires, just what survival looks like in the world you live in. You are going to tell yourself that with enough time and enough prayer, everything will work itself out and you won't have to do the hard thing. You are wrong. The hard thing is the only thing. The hard thing is your child standing in the doorway, terrified and hopeful, handing you his whole heart, and the only response that means anything is to take it. I had time with him at the end. Not enough time, because there is no version of enough time when you have spent 11 years away from someone you love, but I had some. We had Thanksgiving. We had that Easter kitchen. We had phone calls where we talked about nothing important and everything felt fine, which is its own kind of grace. He knew I loved him. I have to believe he knew that, not just because I need to believe it, but because he told me so in a hospital room in Memphis, when I was crying, and he said it's okay. He said it's okay even though it wasn't. He said it because he loved me too, because he had somehow, through everything, kept that intact. That is who my son was. He kept love intact under conditions where most people would have let it die. He was more generous than I deserved. I am telling this story because of the women standing at their counters right now, because of the fathers who are about to go very quiet in a way that will feel, in the moment, like a reasonable response, because of every parent who is running the calculation in their heads, the church, the neighbors, the family dinner, the life they thought they were going to have, and weighing it against the person in the doorway. There is no calculation. The math only goes one way. Your child is standing in the doorway. They are terrified. They have been carrying this toward you for longer than you know. Everything you do in the next 30 seconds will live in them for the rest of their life, and it will live in you too, one way or another. It will live in you. Fight for them, not against them, for them. That is the only thing, in 61 years of living in this world, that I know with complete and total certainty. Fight for your child.